Okay, this is a course in virtue ethics, in the idea that perhaps virtues might help us through things like pandemic, recession, racial discord, political insurrection, and whatever comes our way. Last week, we said that the Christian virtues are Christ-like qualities of character that shape who we hope to become. The Christian way is to grow into the likeness of Christ through the disciplined practice of these attitudes and actions over the course of a lifetime. This isn't about external goods or rewards like getting God to bless us if we're good. It's about who we become. Virtue translates the Greek word arete, which is literally an excellence. As Aristotle put it, the sharpness of a saw is an excellence because it helps the saw cut wood. A virtue is a moral excellence that helps us live better. We'll look closer at what living better means as we examine each virtue. Since last week, I ran into a few objections to the whole project of virtue ethics that I think we can clear up with a super quick historical recap. By the 4th century AD, Christianity identified the core of Christian living as 3 theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, and along with 4 cardinal virtues, prudence, fortitude, justice, and temperance. Then other virtues stem off from there. We took the system of virtues from Greek and Roman philosophy, but we redefined them. St. Augustine, for example, said that the Roman understanding of honor, a kind of warrior virtue, was really a form of individual pride, which is a sin, and idolatry of the empire, which is a worse sin. Now, today, some people object that the virtues are culturally defined and don't fit places and peoples outside of some European norm. But what I want to answer is that the virtues are now and have always been organic, not fixed, and have from the very beginning had to be reinterpreted in new context. Well, the virtues remained the core of Christian morality for 1,200 years until Luther insisted on sola fides, faith alone, rejecting all the other virtues, including hope and love, then redefining faith as meaning theological correctness, holding the right opinions. Then in the 18th century, Catholicism went the opposite direction, replacing the virtues with a rule book. That was called manualist ethics because it took the form of manuals for confessors. The manuals defined what acts were sins and prescribed the appropriate penance for each. Meanwhile, secular philosophy, finding both Catholic and Protestant approaches silly, adopted consequentialism, also called utilitarianism, meaning you measure the morality of an act by its consequences or its utility. The end justifies the means. The end is the greatest benefit for the greatest number. That system, unfortunately, reduced people to producers, consumers, commodities, and instruments in the market. So virtue ethics disappeared, leaving theological correctness for Protestants, following the rules for Catholics, and doing whatever produced the best result for secularists until the cultural cataclysm of World War II. After the war was over, artists, psychologists, sociologists, philosophers, and theologians were all asking, what the hell happened? How could cultured, civilized societies like Germany, Italy, and Spain collapse into hateful, violent, fascist, nationalistic personality cults? How could Kristallnacht and Auschwitz happen? Arnold Schwarzenegger condemned the Capitol riot last week as the American Kristallnacht, where one rioter donned a shirt that said Camp Auschwitz. Well, in response to the cause of World War II question, several major voices brought back virtue ethics. The first and most important was Elizabeth Anscombe, an English Catholic at Oxford. Her paper, Modern Moral Philosophy, rejected consequentialism, which uses us, in favor of virtue, which grows us. Her best work, by the way, was on prudence, so I was grossly remiss in not talking about her last week. The second virtue philosopher, Iris Murdoch, while teaching philosophy at Oxford, also wrote famous novels, so you've probably heard of her. Although she was an atheist, Murdoch wrote to revive the virtues as a way of life, inspired by Aristotle, but even more by Simone Weil. So in the past few years, some feminists have called virtue a guy thing, but its leading modern proponents were Anscombe, Murdoch, and Weil. This isn't to say that traditional virtue ethics is a final answer. It can be enriched by feminist perspectives, such as Robin Dillon did recently in the Oxford Handbook of Virtue. And Valerie Siving rightly cautions that some traditional virtues like humility can actually weaken us as moral agents unless we reinterpret them. No argument. Augustine already said that virtues need constant reframing in their context. But we don't need to throw Anscombe and Murdoch out with the bath on the premise that prudence, fortitude, temperance, and justice are exclusively male traits. Philosopher Grace Lee Boggs, novelist Toni Morrison, and poet Natalie Trethewey are living proof that men have no monopoly on those virtues. And the womanist social ethicist Katie Cannon said that Black women struggling against oppression need virtues like invisible dignity, quiet grace, and unshouted courage. Philosophers like Jennifer Frey and Nancy Snow are continuing the tradition of virtue ethics in compelling ways. Another criticism of virtue ethics is that it sounds like it's about the individual instead of community relationships. That is drastically wrong, because ethics or morality are all about relationship. There is no morality for the solitary individual. Community is the context of all moral practice. Now, some virtue teachers in the old days assumed the context of a community, so they didn't talk about it. But others, from Aristotle in the 4th century BC to Alasdair MacIntyre today, have seen community as necessary to virtue and virtue as necessary to community. Joseph Pieper, a German Catholic philosopher in that post-war era, said that the absence of virtue in the German community had left a cultural vacuum that Nazism filled. MacIntyre focused less on Hitler and more on Stalin. He thought the collapse of the supposedly egalitarian and liberating Russian Revolution into a leftist personality cult of the individual strongman resulted from replacing a virtuous community with a revolutionary vanguard. Political and social virtues, or the lack thereof, are connected. For example, the Capitol rioters were already acting riotously on the airplanes they took to DC. Now, last week we considered prudence, called the mother of all virtues. The dictionary definition of prudence is practical wisdom in practical affairs. But Pieper emphasized it isn't just knowing, it's the knowledge, he says, the knowledge of reality must be transformed into the prudent decision. So prudence is seeing things clearly as they are and then acting sensibly. The first commandment of prudence is deal with the real. So this week we take up fortitude. The dictionary definition is mental and emotional strength in facing difficulty, adversity, danger, or temptation courageously. Fortitude is a rope woven of three cords: courage, strength, and resilience. So as I present on the subject, I invite you to remember people you've known who showed courage, strength, or resilience in the face of challenges, in the hopes that in small group discussion, you may be able to share some stories about them. At Luke 12:32, Jesus said, "Have no fear, little flock, for your Father has resolved to give you the kingdom." The imperative sentence Jesus spoke more than any other was, "Do not be afraid." The Bible says, "Do not be afraid," 365 times, once for each day of the year. Leap year, we're on our own. But it turns out our religion isn't so much about niceness as bravery. To understand what kind of bravery we mean, we look at a verse that tells us why we should be brave. Luke 17:33. Whoever shall seek to save his life shall lose it, and whoever shall lose his life shall preserve it. You see, life is a risky business. Vulnerability is part of the package. And the more we try to secure ourselves, the more we learn how futile those efforts are. We waste our lives, we lose them by trying to carve out security. Joseph Pieper said, "Fortitude presupposes vulnerability. Without vulnerability," he said, "there can be no fortitude because humanity is by nature vulnerable. We can't be brave." We are vulnerable to all manner of misfortunes, but Pieper grounds all our vulnerability, the thousand mortal shocks that flesh is heir to, as Shakespeare put it, to the fundamental fact of mortality. He says, "By injury, we understand every assault on our inviolability, every violation of our inner peace, everything that happens to us or is done against our will, thus everything in any way negative, frightening, or oppressive. But the ultimate injury is death. All fortitude has reference to death. Fortitude is basically readiness to die." Ernest Becker said in his book, The Denial of Death, that all our neuroses and all the things that hold us back from the fullness of life stem from trying to avoid the truth of our mortality. From William James to T.S. Eliot to Henry Miller, literature is replete with accounts of lives unlived because of unwillingness to risk vulnerability. We can't play the game without taking the hits. That doesn't mean we shouldn't love our lives. It doesn't mean we shouldn't feel the pain when we are injured or grieve for ourselves and each other in the face of death. But it does mean to love life, to live it, we have to love it in its mortality, in its precious transcendence. Emily Bronte wrote in her poem Faith, "No coward soul is mine, no trembler in the world's storm-troubled sphere. I see heaven's glory shine, and faith shines equal, arming me from fear. Though earth and moon were gone, and sun and universe ceased to be, and thou wert left alone, every existence would exist in thee." Jesus did not say, "If you have no fear, the Father will give you the kingdom." He said, "The Father has already given you the kingdom, so have no fear." In his last speech, Martin Luther King Jr. recalled having been stabbed almost fatally 10 years earlier. He said he was so grateful he'd survived to see all the good things that had happened since then. But then he ended his last speech that night in Memphis. I would like to live a long life, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land, and I'm so happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. Christian fortitude isn't stoic disregard or contempt for life. It's embracing all of life, including the pain. So fortitude isn't fearlessness. It's grounded in prudence that knows all about danger. But fortitude is also grounded in faith and hope, trusting that in eternity, as Lady Julian said, all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Now, in our society, shaped by action movies and video games, we are apt to associate courage with aggressiveness. That fits the Roman definition of fortitude, but not St. Augustine's. Christian fortitude isn't aggressive. It's sometimes said not to be about attack, but rather endurance. Pieper says, power is so manifestly the very structure of the world that endurance, not wrathful attack, is the decisive test of actual fortitude, which is nothing else than to love and to realize that which is good in the face of injury or death. I want to say that endurance is definitely part of it. Some hardships are inevitable. Lashing out doesn't help. Endurance is what we do unless we cave in. But other hardships, like injustice, in those cases, endurance sounds too passive. Sometimes fortitude is more about persistence. Now, endurance and persistence are different, but they have something in common: patience. Fortitude is a long-haul virtue. Now, as we practice this endurance, persistence, patience, what are we to do with our anger? St. Thomas Aquinas is explicit and emphatic that anger is an appropriate response to evil. And here by evil, we mean things not being good, kind, life-giving as they should be. Evil here can include a political injustice, or it can be nature going against us, as with wildfires or with diseases. St. Thomas says that we are right to be angry. The word anger was introduced into the English language around 1200 by Brother Ormond, an Augustinian monk living in Mercia, then a Danish region of England. He took the word from the Norse noun angra, which means affliction, and the Norse verb angra, which means to grieve. Anger is our grief over the distance between how things are and how they ought to be. The reason we pray, thy kingdom come, is that it isn't here yet. Things are not as God or we would have them be, so we are angry. But how do we fold our anger into fortitude? Ephesians 4:26-27 says, be angry, but do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and do not give the devil a foothold. Jesus, whom we are imitating, got angry at the Pharisees, the Sadducees, money changers in the temple, his disciples, his family, and even at God. So the first thing we do with anger is to be angry. Acknowledge it, not pretend it away. The second thing is to manage it. Do not sin means literally do not miss the mark. Don't get distracted. Don't lose your head. Don't let an amygdala hijack make you do something stupid. Keep your anger in the passenger seat, but don't give it the steering wheel. Fortitude keeps our anger at a slow boil, maybe a simmer. The third point, do not let the sun go down on your anger, means don't get stuck in it. Don't identify it. Don't identify with it. That's when we lose ourselves. And the final point about anger is to recognize what really lies behind it. The poet David Whyte says, anger is the deepest form of compassion for another person, for the world, for the self, for a life, for the body, for a family, and for our ideals, all vulnerable and all possibly about to be hurt. Proper anger, White is teaching us, is a form of love. So it's important to keep our love in view. When we lose the point of our love and the anger becomes a thing in itself, there again, we lose ourselves. But anger grounded in love fuels our fortitude. Well, what about fear? Fear is the other side of the same coin as anger. The angriest people, the most violently angry people, are often covering the greatest fear. Well, we've already said fortitude has room for fear. But just as fortitude manages our anger, it also manages our anxiety. Dread of one thing can morph into a generalized attitude of fear and loathing that can turn violent. Before George Floyd last year, the pandemic began with a wave of xenophobic violence against Asian Americans. Fear is contagious. It spreads in a society through pheromones, just like an airborne virus. We catch it from each other. Then the cable news, social media, and rumors fuel it. Communication professor James Dillard says, once the world feels like a dangerous place where bad things happen, fear knows few limits. I recently heard a rap song written by a 9-year-old. The important part of that is recently heard, written by a 9-year-old, that went, be afraid, be very afraid, because if you're not afraid, you're not aware. But fear, it turns out, doesn't keep us safe. Fear makes us more vulnerable to political manipulation and conspiracy theories. Fear, manifesting as chronic stress, raises our inflammation levels, increasing our risk for infection. So what to do with fear? Do not be afraid does not mean do not feel fear. It means don't live in your fear. Don't believe your fears. Don't let fear control your life. Have your fears. Fears have you. Nadia Bowles-Weber recently said, don't let fear define the contours of your heart. Love does that. So, what are we afraid of? Death, illness, financial stress, loneliness, loss of the meaning we used to find in our daily activities. When the generalized, too big to manage fear is on the loose, it's apt to infect us. But to get our feet on the ground and focus on our own fears instead of being caught up in mob panic, we identify our personal threat and look it in the eye. The beginning of fortitude is to name the fear. Then notice how it feels in your body. Where do you feel it and what's it like? Is it tightness or a flutter? Just let it, you don't identify with the fear. You don't judge it as valid or invalid. Just let it be the feeling that it is. Attend to it. Hold it as you might hold a frightened child. You let it be, but do not let it rule. Then remember that others are afraid too. Pray for them and find some small act of kindness you can do for somebody. A call, a note, order them something online. Any act of kindness will do. Saint Therese of Lisieux and Mother Teresa both said, "We live our faith not in grandiose gestures, but in small acts done with faith." The art of fortitude in the fearful time is to make our fear the occasion to practice love, because our Bible teaches there is no room for fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. So I'll close by summarizing fortitude with David White's definition of courage. He writes, "Courage is the measure of our heartfelt participation with life, with another, with a community, a work, a future. To be courageous is to make conscious those things we already feel deeply and then live through the unending vulnerabilities. To be courageous is to seat our feelings deeply in the body and in the world, to live up to and into the relationships that already exist, with things we already care deeply about, with a person, a future, a possibility in society, or with the unknown that begs us on and has always begged us on. To be courageous is to stay close to the way we are made." So in our small groups, I invite you to call to mind someone who has exhibited some of these aspects of fortitude that we've been describing, and to share stories about how that person manifested those qualities or those aspects of fortitude. And that's the priority, because the best way to learn virtue is not from these abstract words that I'm saying, but from thinking of examples, by learning from people. But then if you have time, if there's more time left over than you've spent on remembering the individuals, I would invite you to share stories about times in your life when you have been challenged to exercise fortitude, and where you've looked, how you have gone about finding the strength you needed to face the struggles which faced you then. All right, thank you. Mary Kate.
Thank you, Father Dan. I'm going to stop our recording and